You are standing on a stone platform in the open air, and you do not know what the wooden tablet around your neck says. You can hear at least a dozen languages. None of them are yours. A man with a scroll is reading something aloud, and the crowd in front of you is not looking at your face. Yesterday you had a name. Today you have a price. This is Delos, 52 BC, the largest slave market in the Mediterranean world, and one of the most efficiently run commercial operations in human history. What you are about to witness was not exceptional. It was Tuesday. She was from a prominent ancient Western European tribe. That much the tablet said. The tribe of the chieftain who had come closer than any man before him to stopping the expanding empire, and who had surrendered at the hill fort less than 48 hours ago. Military dispatches record what happened next. The aristocracy was enslaved. The fighters were executed or displayed. The women, the daughters, the wives, the noble women who had stood at the edge of the battlefield and watched the surrender, were processed. That word, processed, it is the right word. We will come back to it. The tablet around her neck was required at auction. It listed her origin, her approximate age, her assessed skills, and a legal declaration at the bottom in a language she could not yet read, without known defect. She was not a person being evaluated. She was a product being warranted. The buyer who stopped in front of her did not speak to her. He spoke to the auctioneer. A price was named. A counter was made. The transaction took less time than it takes to purchase a bolt of linen. When his hand closed around her wrist, she understood not the words, not the law, not yet, but the geometry of it. The platform was behind her. The crowd was thinning. Behind her, the next woman was already stepping forward. The auctioneer barely paused. Here is what the history books rarely tell you about that platform. It was not hidden. It was not shameful by the empire's own accounting. It was celebrated infrastructure. Ancient sources described this harbor as capable of processing tens of thousands of people in a single day. Not as an allegation, but as a boast. The island had been granted special status, specifically to facilitate this commerce. The harbor, the warehouses, the stone auction blocks, and the legal architecture underneath it was airtight, according to the ancient empire's jurisprudential tradition, which compiled centuries of legal precedent. The act of military conquest extinguished something called capit, legal personhood. The moment imperial forces took her, she ceased to exist as a legal subject. She became res, a thing, not a prisoner with rights, not an enemy with status, a thing in the precise technical vocabulary of ancient property law. This was not a gray area debated by radical jurists. It was a foundational, publicly argued, universally accepted operating principle of one of history's greatest civilizations. Ancient scholars categorized enslaved people alongside livestock and movable property without apology or qualification, because in ancient imperial law, that is exactly what they were. The machine that consumed her had a name, a budget, a legal department, and a Senate that approved its operation every single year. And imperial law, it turns out, had a very specific term for what awaited her inside a wealthy household. It was not a crime. It did not have a victim category. That term, and what it meant for women like her, is what this documentary is actually about. She arrived at the household after dark. That detail matters. Ancient household management texts describe the deliberate practice of introducing newly acquired, captured people at night, when the architecture of the space was most disorienting and the hierarchy most visible. Torchlight, the smell of unfamiliar food. A woman, herself enslaved, the household manager, walking her through rooms she was not permitted to remember the layout of yet. The first thing they gave her was a name. Not her name, an imperial name. Short, functional, easy to call across a courtyard. The wooden tablet had carried one designation. This household gave her another, her tribal name, the name her father had spoken at her birth, the name that carried her lineage and her tribe, was not forbidden. It simply stopped being used. Within a week, it had disappeared from every conversation around her. Within a month, she would catch herself not thinking in it. The geography of the household was a geography of surveillance. Scholars of ancient domestic architecture note that large urban households were designed, often deliberately, to minimize unsupervised movement. Captured people ate together. slept in shared quarters, worked in visible spaces. Privacy was a structural privilege, distributed strictly by status. The household manager watched her. Other enslaved members of the household watched the manager. Everyone's security depended on demonstrating loyalty to the order above them. She was learning the imperial language in the only way available to her, by listening, by watching faces when words were spoken, by mapping consequence to sound. She was good at it. She had been educated. She was tribal aristocracy, and that education was part why the buyer had paid what he paid. One evening, near the end of her third week, she overheard two men speaking near the entrance to the master's private rooms. She caught perhaps a quarter of the words, but she caught the gesture toward her. She caught the repetition. She did not yet know what the phrase meant. The documentary voice cuts in, cold and quiet. She's been set aside for the master. Let's talk about what ancient imperial law actually permitted inside that household, because the answer is more precise and more devastating than most popular historical accounts acknowledge. Ancient jurists were not imprecise men. They named things carefully, and they had named this carefully. The master's right of life and death over his household appears in ancient legal texts from the early Republic through the imperial period. Its practical application was gradually constrained by later rulers, but its conceptual foundation was never dismantled. The master's authority over enslaved members of his household was absolute. More operationally significant were the legal codes governing what we might broadly call violation of bodily integrity. Here is what those laws actually said. This was a crime against status. It was an offense committed against a person of recognized social standing, a freeborn woman, a citizen. The law was not protecting a body. It was protecting a rank. Enslaved people had no rank. Therefore, by the explicit written, professionally argued logic of ancient jurisprudence, they had nothing that could be violated in the legal sense. This was not a loophole. It was not an oversight. It was a conclusion ancient legal scholars reached, wrote down, published, debated, and affirmed across centuries of jurisprudential tradition. Ancient moralists did occasionally express what reads to modern eyes as discomfort. They wrote that enslaved people were human beings. They wrote that they deserved basic decency. They wrote this in letters, from villas maintained by hundreds of enslaved workers, to an audience of men who owned similar households. They never argued for abolition. They asked at most for courtesy. The system did not require his courtesy. It was already working exactly as designed. Here is a problem that sits at the center of this entire documentary, and it is a problem that took historians an embarrassingly long time to name directly. We know almost everything about ancient imperial slavery from the people who owned the enslaved. Every major source, every household management manual, every legal text, every philosophical letter, every military dispatch was written by free men for free men about enslaved people as objects of administration. Ancient writers tell masters how to keep enslaved women productive through pregnancy. One writer, in a passage that has been quoted in classic seminars for centuries without sufficient horror, compares the three categories of agricultural tools: those that cannot speak, those that can make sounds, and those that can speak. The third category is enslaved people. He is not being cruel. He is being organizational. Even the most humane surviving ancient engagement with the institution never once questions whether the institution should exist. He questions its excesses. He does not question its architecture. We do not have a single surviving text written by an enslaved woman from the ancient imperial period. Not a letter, not a testament, not a prayer scratched into stone. Not one. The narration is careful here. This is not simply an accident of preservation. Enslaved people in large ancient households were frequently denied literacy as a deliberate control mechanism. Those who were literate, secretaries, accountants, tutors, produced documents in service of their master's purposes. What the archive preserved is what the system intended to preserve. The silence is not neutral. The silence was engineered. But the ground is beginning to talk. Excavations in ancient buried cities, ongoing and still producing results, have uncovered slave quarters, skeletal remains bearing markers of chronic physical labor beginning in childhood, and graffiti scratched into walls in languages other than the imperial tongue. Historians are reconstructing, fragment by fragment, the texture of lives a written record refused to keep. One skeletal analysis identified a young woman, estimated between 14 and 18 years of age, with bone density and joint deformation consistent with years of heavy repetitive labor. Her dental isotope analysis indicated she was not from the Central Empire. She was from somewhere else. She arrived somehow. The record does not say how or when or what her name was. Where she came from is about to reframe everything you thought you understood about that auction platform in the harbor. Months had passed. She had learned enough of the imperial language to follow a conversation across a room. She had learned the household's internal map of danger, who had the master's ear, which tasks carried punishment if done wrong, how small privileges were distributed and why. She had learned to be useful in ways that were noticed, and invisible in ways that were safer, and she had identified something she believed was a path forward: formal freedom. She had seen it discussed. She had seen another enslaved woman in the household, older, trusted, a skilled weaver, receive what appeared to be increasing favor. She had begun to understand the shape of the transaction: loyal service, demonstrated competence, the master's goodwill. It was not guaranteed, but it existed. Here is what she did not know, and here's the reframe this entire documentary has been building toward. Formal freedom was real. For certain categories of enslaved people, educated men, urban administrators, skilled freedmen with commercial value, it was even relatively common. Ancient historians have sometimes used this fact to soften the institution's portrait. There were paths out, they note. The system had flexibility. What those accounts consistently underweight is this: for women captured in military conquest, formal freedom rates were dramatically, documentably lower. And more critically, freedom was not an exit. It was a renegotiation. A freed woman became legally bound to her former master as a patron. She owed documented labor obligations, specified in the agreement itself. Her marriage required his approval. Her property remained subject to his legal claims. Her children, if born before this transaction, remained enslaved. Ancient jurists are explicit on this point. The patron's rights over a freed woman were extensive, enforceable, and did not expire. Freedom, for women like her, was not the opposite of slavery. It was slavery with different paperwork. She did not know this yet. She was still working toward it. The chapter ends on the day she witnessed the weaver's ceremony in the household courtyard. The word spoken, the magistrate's rod touching the woman's shoulder in the ritual gesture of liberation. She watched the weaver's face. She studied it for the things she expected to find there. 3 days later, the weaver was back in this house, back at her loom, working. The terms of her freedom required it. The expression on the captured tribal woman's face as she understood what she was seeing. The documentary does not describe it. It does not need to. The men who built this system were not monsters. That is the most important and most disturbing thing about them. They were senators and jurists and household economists. They were men who wrote careful letters about friendship and virtue, who funded public baths and grain distributions, who argued with genuine sophistication about the nature of justice. And in the same years they did all of that, they sat down and engineered, with deliberate, documented precision, a legal architecture designed to make certain categories of human beings permanently, generationally, self-replenishingly available for exploitation. The mechanism at the center of that architecture was called the womb principle. The principle was simple. The legal status of a child followed the status of the mother at the moment of birth, not the father. The mother. This was not the universal practice of ancient slave systems. The expanding empire made the womb principle a cornerstone, and the choice was not accidental. Consider what it produced. An enslaved woman did not merely represent her own labor value. She represented the labor value of every child she would bear inside that household. Her body was, in the precise vocabulary of ancient property law, a self-replicating asset. Imperial decrees extended and clarified this principle's application, closing what limited interpretive gaps remained. Scholars of ancient economic history now understand this not as incidental cruelty, but as deliberate capital strategy. Enslaved women in ancient households were simultaneously workers, domestic resources, and biological infrastructure. One prominent ancient jurist, writing in the 3rd century, produced the most comprehensive surviving analysis of this framework. He described it with the dispassionate clarity a man auditing ledgers. He named the categories, traced the legal logic, identified the edge cases, and resolved them. He was not advocating. He was documenting a system he considered as natural and permanent as a calendar. The system he had so carefully documented outlived him by centuries. His words survived in legal digest compiled 300 years after his death, still cited, still operational. They still described a world in which the children of enslaved women were property before they drew their first breath. If this machinery was this precisely designed, if the legal architecture was this deliberately constructed, then the question the documentary has been circling F. Years had passed. The household had changed around in a way that ancient households changed, through death, debt, and the slow redistribution of property that followed both. The master was dying. She knew it before the physicians confirmed it. She had learned to read this household the way she had once read her tribal landscape, by small signs, by patterns of behavior, by the particular quality of silence that preceded consequential events. When the notary arrived, she understood what his presence meant. Ancient estate transitions were moments of maximum vulnerability for enslaved people. Debts had to be assessed. Assets had to be inventoried. Enslaved people were assets. The notary moved to the household with a wax tablet, speaking in the flat professional language of administration, and a junior clerk wrote down what he said. She was brought before him. He did not look at her face. He assessed her age. She was older now, the years of the household visible in her hands and her posture. He noted her skills, updated from the original wooden auction tablet. He noted her current value in silver coins, adjusted downward from her auction price to reflect her age and upward from it to reflect her demonstrated competence. He noted her household name, the imperial name given her the week she arrived, the name that had replaced her tribal one so completely that she now thought in it first. And then he noted her children, 2 children, born in this household, listed in the inventory as separate line entries, each with their own assessed value. They were listed after the dining furniture and before the silverware. The notary's voice did not change register between the couches and the children. The clerk's stylus did not pause. This is the moment the original wooden tablet completes its meaning. The heavy tablet hung around her neck at the ancient harbor had been a document of acquisition. The inventory being compiled now was a document of continuation. She had not been consumed by the system. She had been incorporated into it. Her children were not her legacy. They were the system's return on its original investment. Somewhere in the dry, document-preserving sand of an ancient desert province, there survives a real estate inventory from the imperial period. Scholars have read it. It lists household goods, land assessments, and enslaved people with their values and dependencies. One entry near the bottom reads, in translation, 1 female, origin unknown, value assessed. Children, 2, status without defect. The inventory survived. The woman did not. Her children's names are recorded. Their fates are not. The document was preserved because it was useful to someone. She was not preserved because she was not. After a devastating ancient Eastern siege, a famous historian, himself a former prisoner of the empire, a man who had watched his own people process through the same machinery, recorded what happened to the survivors of the fallen city. He gave figures. Historians debate their precision, but not their order of magnitude. The slave markets of the Eastern Sea absorbed the aftermath of that war the same way they had absorbed the aftermath of every tribal fortress, of every great coastal city, of every military campaign the empire had prosecuted for 3 centuries. Efficiently, completely, without administrative drama. The infrastructure was ready because it was always ready. This was not improvisation. The empire did not scramble to handle its conquered populations. It scheduled them. And yet, for all that documented scale, for all the military dispatches, the historians' figures, and the geographers' descriptions of the island harbor processing tens of thousands of human beings in a single day, the faces are almost entirely gone. The names are almost entirely gone. What survives is the machinery's paperwork, not the machinery's victims. Almost entirely. In the dry burial grounds of an ancient desert province, attached to bodies preserved by climate and sand, a remarkable collection of painted portraits survives. These ancient funerary portraits, named for the oasis region where most were found, are among the most arresting objects the ancient world left behind. They are painted on wood in colored wax, with naturalism that feels almost contemporary. They show individual faces, specific eyes, particular expressions. Some of these individuals have been identified through accompanying documents as enslaved or formerly enslaved people. They look directly at you. They have always looked directly at you. They were looking at you 2,000 years before you were born, waiting for someone to look back. The painful irony the documentary cannot release. We have their faces because imperial funerary culture value portraiture. We do not have their names, their origins, or their inner lives because the system that commissioned the portraits also commissioned the silence around them. The image was preserved. The person behind it was not considered worth preserving in the same way. Late imperial law did eventually move. Later rulers introduced limited constraints on masters' absolute authority. Legal reform centuries later tightened those constraints further, extending narrow legal recognitions to enslaved people that earlier imperial law had categorically denied. Scholars sometimes cite this as evidence of the system's capacity for moral evolution. The narration will not be generous about this. Those reforms came 5, 6, 7 centuries after the women of the tribal fortresses and the eastern cities were processed through the island harbors. They came after generations of children were born into bondage under the womb principle. They came after the bodily integrity laws had protected status and not persons for hundreds of years. They arrived, in other words, after everyone this documentary is about was already dead, and they did not dismantle the architecture. They renovated it. The women who stood on that stone platform did not live to see even the renovation. Ancient imperial slavery has been studied for 2 centuries with genuine scholarly rigor. The economics are well mapped. The political dimensions are thoroughly analyzed. The philosophical debates among ancient thinkers about the nature of the institution have been examined in thousands of academic papers. And for most of that 2 centuries, the specific experience of women captured in military conquest, their legal erasure, their reproductive exploitation, their systematic anonymity, occupied the margins of the field. The narration asks why, and then it answers carefully because the answer matters. The sources that survived were the sources the ancient culture valued preserving: legal texts, military histories, philosophical correspondence, the records of senatorial decisions and imperial decrees. These documents were copied by medieval scribes, collected by later humanists, edited by modern scholars, and taught in universities that considered them the foundation of civilization. They were written by and for the class of men who owned enslaved people. They described the institution in the owner's vocabulary, through the owner's categories, for the owner's purposes. The wooden auction tablet was one of the most common objects in the ancient world. Almost none survive. Wood rots, but more importantly, no one thought to preserve them. They were inventory tags. You do not archive inventory tags.